Stay connected to your community and save. Just 99 cents a month gets you 3 months of unlimited access to Inform.com. Visit Inform.com/subscribe and get your first 3 months of news for only 99 cents a month.
Rumors have circulated for 100 years that Al Capone was a Minnesota lake lover and friend to the owner of East Grand Forks' Whiteys bar. But is it fact or fiction? Hi, this is Tracy Briggs, and welcome to Back Then. Before I get started on this story, I should say it is part 3 of a series we call The Capones of North Dakota. Part 1 told the story of Al Capone's older brother, Vincenzo, who worked in law enforcement in North Dakota during Prohibition. And in part 2, we told you the story of a teenage waitress in a small North Dakota town who shared her story of the night she served steak to Al Capone. Now, you don't necessarily have to listen to all 3 parts in the same order, but if you'd like to check those 2 out, just check on Forum Communications, The Vault, and also Back Then, and both of those stories are in those podcasts. Was it simply wishful thinking for the fine people of North Dakota and western Minnesota that the most famous gangster in the world would want to spend time in their prairie towns and on their quiet lake shores? It couldn't really be true, right? Why would Al Capone, public enemy number 1, leave his mob empire in Chicago to escape to the sedate upper Midwest? But if we are to believe the countless yarns from the 1920s that still get spun today, Al Capone slept here. Was he here for work, running his moonshine operation out of Minot, or getting close to the Canadian border to oversee his whiskey smuggling operation? Or was he here just to relax, to hunt and fish, or take off his expensive wingtips and dip his toes in several of Minnesota's 10,000 lakes? Recently, Forum Communications examined how Capone turned the North Shore of Minnesota, as well as parts of Wisconsin, into his land of leisure. But it turns out Capone, more than likely, made his way to western Minnesota and eastern North Dakota as well. Here are just a few of the places he is believed to have been, either for work or pleasure. First, Mackinac, Grand Forks County, North Dakota. When he was stationed at the Grand Forks Air Force Base in the late 80s and early 90s, Gary Asproth heard many stories of Capone's sightings in the tiny town of Mackinac, about 20 miles northwest of Grand Forks. Here's what he said. "I met the people from around there, and of course, anything to do with his history always interested me, growing up with the dad I had." What did he mean by that? Well, Asproth's father, Carl, was a police officer in Duluth, not far from one of Al Capone's camps in northern Wisconsin. While Asproth said his father didn't talk much about the connections he had to Capone, Gary's godmother spilled the beans a few years back. Here's what he recalled. "She told me, I have to tell you this story because nobody else in the family is going to tell it. When I was a cigarette girl, your dad used to take me and a couple of other girls, and he would drive us up to Capone's camp. He would bring Tommy guns and dancing girls. We went about 4 times. So, of course, hearing stories like that from his godmother made his ears perk up a little bit when he heard what he calls credible accounts from old-timers in Mackinac about gatherings of gangsters outside of town in the 1920s, similar to the parties his godmother told him about. He said, "It was very eerie because I guess the vehicles came in at night and they would have these parties, gambling parties. It was during Prohibition, so that's probably why they kept it so under wraps. They always had alcohol and prostitution and all this other stuff going on." Asproth said he believes the gangsters stayed somewhere between Emerado and Mackinac. The 2 towns are about a half-hour away from Petersburg, where waitresses at a small-town cafe shared credible accounts of once serving Capone's crew dinner. Again, that was part 2 of our podcast, The Capones of North Dakota. All of the towns are near Highway 2, which was believed to have been a popular route for bootlegging traffic during Prohibition. Asproth said. "If you know Mackinac, it's this tiny town, so I was blown away when I found out what had transpired here." The next Al Capone sighting? Supposedly in Little Chicago, Minot, North Dakota. During Prohibition, Minot became known as Little Chicago because of its reputation for lawlessness, everything from opium dens and prostitution to rum running and secret tunnels. The tunnels were constructed underneath some downtown buildings and some say used by Al Capone for his liquor smuggling operation. Now, while Capone was most likely never burrowing through those tunnels himself, some have claimed he came to town occasionally to check in on the operation. Next, East Grand Forks, Minnesota. Did Capone make an appearance in East Grand Forks, Minnesota, once called the wickedest city in the world? Some people in the city across the river from North Dakota said yes. Greg Stennis is a longtime partner and former manager of Whiteys Wonder Bar and Cafe in East Grand Forks. In 2017, he told the Grand Forks Herald, "East Grand Forks was kind of naughty back in the day." Stennis began bussing tables there in 1968 for Edwin Whitey Larson, who, of course, the bar is named for. He had opened what he called the Coney Island Lunchroom when he was just 19 years old in 1925. That was just 5 years after the passage of Prohibition. Stennis said, Whitey made most of his money with slot machines and whiskey. There were 40 bars in downtown East Grand Forks. Go figure. Rumors were flying about Whitey Larson being good friends with Al Capone, but Stennis said Larson never told him about that, and he said it isn't the kind of thing he would have kept quiet about. Stennis says he also heard tales of Capone and the block-long secret tunnels leading from the saloons to the Red River, but he doubts all the stories are true. West Central Minnesota Lakes Country. Rumors of Al Capone either visiting lakes in west central Minnesota, not far from East Grand Forks, are as common as sunburn in August. Rumors have Capone being spotted at several lakes, including Little Bemidji, Fishhook Lake, Big Bass Lake, Lake Melissa, and many more. But is Capone at the lake Minnesota's version of the Loch Ness Monster? Truth or legend? Doug Schumann owns Rainbow Resort on Little Bemidji Lake, located in northwestern Minnesota, 20 miles from Itasca State Park. His grandparents opened the resort in 1958. He is quick to point out that the Capone rumors circulating at the resort for years are unsubstantiated, but frequently told. They suggest Capone mixed business at the Canadian border with pleasure at the lake. Here's what he said. The stories are that he would go up there to check on his smuggling operation, find out how things were going. Then he used to run through this area. In fact, a granddaughter of Capone's driver once said that Capone's very favorite drive in the entire country was the drive from Park Rapids to Bemidji because of its great beauty. Asproth said the hunting and fishing alone also could have brought Capone to the area. Even the most famous gangster in the world occasionally might want to hang up the gone fishing sign. Asproth said Capone loved fishing. When he got out of prison, that's primarily what he did. He kind of retired out of the mob scene and just did a lot of fishing. Schumann said the topography of the land was also appealing to the gangsters. He said, when the lumber industry started coming up here in the early 1900s to log all the pine trees, they created all these little trails and roads for these guys to use as back roads instead of using highways. Then, every once in a while, he'd want to hang out in that little cabin when the heat was on. That little cabin is actually 2 small cabins across the lake from Rainbow Resort. Schumann said the main cabin was once used as a bar and restaurant for loggers in the area. By the 20s and 30s, it was pretty rustic and bare bones, and the place, some people say, Capone hid. Schumann said, the main cabin is an original log cabin with a big screened-in porch in the front of it, but the little cabin sits off in the woods. In the summer with the trees, you can barely see it in there. Asproth knew people on Fishhook Lake that said Al Capone had been a friend of their family and had even fished there until the feds found out where he was. Asproth said, Capone had his driver parked on the other side of the lake and went across the lake in a rowboat and got out of there. And stories like this have been told for years around the bonfires of Minnesota's 10,000 lakes, over sips of beer and bites of sticky s'mores. But are they just campfire stories, heard on these still waters as often as the call of the loon? How much is fact and how much is fiction? It's just so hard to tell. Virgil Stenberg, who is a retired University of North Dakota professor who later lived in Bemidji, told Mysteries Magazine in 2002 that Al Capone was indeed in Bemidji on various occasions, while retired FBI Special Agent Ed Reig said he had never heard of specific sightings, at least in Bemidji, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. He said, "It wouldn't surprise me at all. Those fellas got around, and they had a lot of hideouts." Asproth agrees. "Let's put it this way," he said. "Capone had places all over the place. I think the bottom line is there are just too many stories out there for at least some of them not to be true." Greg Stennis, again of Whiteys fame, might have summed it up best. He said, "Some stories are just yarns, but they're not necessarily untruths either. Sometimes the unknown, the could have been, is much more fun anyhow." And that is Back Then. I hope you'll join us next time.
Get reliable and accurate local news with Inform.com. Inform.com is your trusted local news source with journalists dedicated to keeping you informed about what's happening in your community. Visit Inform.com now.